Welcome to the OLLI at SBU lecture series. Today we have Marty Levinson, who is one of our very own OLLI workshop leaders here. He has written and lectured extensively on topics of historical interest. He's a member of the Foreign Policy Association, and for the last 4 years has taught their Great Decisions program for us here at OLLI. He holds a PhD from NYU and lives in Riverhead, New York. So I am going to turn it right over to Marty. Thank you for coming.
Yo, thank you, Liz. And I thank Liz again. She helped me with my PowerPoint, made the illustrations a lot more clear. So I thank her for her technical expertise. And I thank all you for showing up today. It's a beautiful day. I think we'll set a record on Long Island. So the fact that you're here and not at the beach or somewhere else is great. So anyway, obviously we're all here for the same lecture on Ukraine, the borderlands of history. My plan is I have a PowerPoint. I'll put it on the screen. I'll do the talk, and there'll be time at the end for questions and answers. So with that said, let's get right to the PowerPoint, and it is right over here. Okay. So this is it, Borderlands, a history of Ukraine, and we'll start right away. There you see Ukraine, the surrounding countries. To the north is Belarus. Belarus, big ally of Russia. As a matter of fact, Russia has, probably many of you know, has troops up there. They may again invade from the north. Then you see Poland, Romania, a little bit of Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Moldova. So Ukraine's Romania. So Ukraine's surrounded by a number of countries. So let's get to the early history. Now, obviously, you could start early history, from Neanderthal times, but we'll start with the early Middle Ages. Now we're going to start with the Vikings, who come down the Dnieper River. That's Dnieper, you don't pronounce the D, it's D-N-I-E-P-E-R. So they're coming down the Dnieper River in the 8th century, 9th century. And the first Viking to establish rulership in Ukraine is this fellow by the name of Oleg of Novgorod. And he seizes key from the residents there, and he's the start of what they call the Kievan Rus. And Rus, of course, is the first syllable in Russia. And Rus is a Viking word, which means rower. And so what happened is, the Vikings come from Scandinavia, so they're rowing down the Dnieper River, they're heading towards Constantinople, and they want to take over territory and do trade with the Ottomans. So Oleg is the first ruler. So then we're moving on to the 10th and 11th century. Now we have Vladimir the Great. It's always nice to be a ruler with the name the Great. I think Putin wants to be Putin the Great. I think he's modeling his leadership after Peter the Great. But in any event, in 988 AD, we have the Grand Prince of Kiev, which is Vladimir the Great, and he's looking for a religion. Before this time, they really don't have a specific religion. They worship whatever the Vikings are worshiping, but they're not part of the three major religions, which are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So it's probably a myth, but it's a myth I kind of like. So he's interviewing people from the different religions, emissaries from different religions, Judaism, Christianity, and the Muslim religion, and he picks Christianity. He likes that one. And so now Ukraine, not Ukraine at the time, by the way, it's just sort of this big, vast land that the Vikings are in. And there's not Russia at the time either. There's just different, at the time, actually, what we would consider Russia would be something called the Duchy, D-U-C-H-Y, of Muscovy. They're the closest to Russia, but Russia really doesn't exist. But in any event, Vladimir the Great is heading the Kievan Rus, which is the land which would kind of a lot of Ukraine today. And he's going to be Christian, and now he sets the stage for a church. It's going to be called the Uniate Church. And that church is going to be in Ukraine. And now today we have two big churches in Ukraine, Uniate Church, the Ukrainian church. And we also have the Russian Orthodox Church, which is in the eastern part of Ukraine. And that's a problem for people living in Ukraine who are members of those churches, because the patriarch of that church is supporting Putin. So if you're Ukrainian, you're a member of the Orthodox Church, you have a problem if you want to be part of Ukraine. And most of the people in Ukraine want it to be, at least at this stage, want it to be an independent country. Okay, so now we're into 1237 to 1240, moving along. We have the Mongols. They're coming in from China, Mongolia. They're riding west, and they invade the Rus principalities. And they come in, they come out, they come back again, and they take over various parts of Ukraine. They take over Crimea. And the group that's known there are the Tatars, Tatars, and they're part of the Mongolians. Maybe you've heard about them. I'm sure you've heard about the Mongols. You read about them. The Golden Horde. Remember that in history? I was always looking, what does that mean, the Golden Horde? Were they out for gold? The answer is no. Their tents were supposedly colored gold, so they're known as the Golden Horde. Anyway, the Mongols come in and they kind of rule the place for a while. And then from 1349 to 1430, we have Poland, and then the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. They annex a large part of the country. So that's what's ruling Ukraine. In 1441, you have the Crimean Khanate. They break free of the Mongols, so they're a sort of special group, and they're ruling, Crimea. And in 1596, I said before, you have the two churches. You have the Uniate Church and the Russian Orthodox Church. So let's show you some of the PowerPoint illustrations, nice and clear, thanks to Liz. We have Vladimir the Great. I guess he looked like that. There were this wasn't photography at the time, so these were paintings. There's the Mongol invasion. Obviously, this kid wasn't part of it, but this is sort of what maybe Mongols look like. I guess that's a falcon. Divided churches, that's a great shot. The really clear shot. Okay, so now we're going to continue with our early history. Anyway, now we have the Cossacks. Cossacks are great. I mean, they're fun. Well, not fun if you're getting killed by a Cossack, but they're a very strong warrior-like group. They're really what many of the Ukrainians, they're descendants from Cossacks, so they're a tough group. So anyway, they established what's called the Hetmanate from 1648 to 1657. They rise against the Poles. The Poles are ruling them. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is ruling them. And the locals want to rise against the Poles. So these Cossacks rise against the Poles. And the guy that leads them is a fellow by the name of Bohdan Khmelnytsky. He declares himself the ruler of the Ruthenian state, which is the Rus state, or the Russian state. And in February 1649, he fights against the Polish domination, but he needs help. So he asks help from the Duchy of Muscovy, and they said, "Sure, we'll give you help." And there's two interpretations about what happens then. Putin says when the Duchy of Muscovy gave help, and that later became Russia, he was saying that the Ukrainians or the Cossacks agreed that they would be then absorbed as part of the Duchy of Muscovy. And the Ukrainians were saying, no, we asked for help. Thank you very much. You sent your help, appreciate it. But then, that was it. We'd like you, but we're not going to be part of you. So that's, although I'll talk about today, it's interesting. You could talk about either interpretation, but it doesn't really affect the fact that Ukraine is a separate country. Okay, so then there's other things are happening. It's not on the PowerPoint. In 1686, you have something called the Treaty of Eternal Peace. I love that name, because that'll never happen, between Russia and Poland. And so they're going to partition the Hetmanate. Okay, so let me get to 1764. That's also not here, but Russia abolishes the Eastern Hetmanate and establishes what they call the Little Russia Governorate. Now, sometimes you hear Putin, I've heard him, he refers to the Ukrainians and the Belarusians as Little Russians. That doesn't mean they're small people, height-wise. That means they're part of the greater Russian Federation, but, they're not truly Russian, but they're Little Russians. They're sort of outskirts of Russia, and he refers to them as Little Russia. But anyway, Russia abolishes Little Hetmanate, and in 1781, they're going to actually annex Ukraine, and in 1783, Russia annexes Crimea. So now they're not annexing all of Ukraine. Ukraine is still not a country. So they're annexing pretty much what's Eastern Ukraine, including Kyiv. Western Ukraine still is part of Poland and eventually is going to be part of Austria. All right, so let's get into the 19th century. And in the 19th century, you have a lot of people in Ukraine that really feel that it ought to be a separate place. They have a separate language. They speak Ukrainian, which is similar to Russian, but different. Now, even today, many Ukrainians speak Russian. I mean, Zelensky, who's the the president, he speaks Russian, and many of them speak Russian. But Ukrainian is the language there, and they speak Ukrainian. But in the 19th century, what happens is many of the people there really want Ukraine to be separate, not little Russia, but they want it to be a separate place. So they start being nationalistic. And many countries in the 19th century, underwent Italy, South America, Bolivar, Argentina, Venezuela, a lot of these places wanted to be, separate countries, and Ukraine did too. Russia didn't because Russia was controlling them, so they were starting to then outlaw the Ukrainian language, no Ukrainian literature. But the Ukrainian, there was an underground. You want to be nationalistic, you fight for your nation. We did that with the revolution, so that's what they did. All right, so there's the Cossacks coming in, raping and pillaging. That's what Cossacks do, at least back then. There's Kyiv in the 19th century, beautiful city. I mean, it's a beautiful city today, getting rocket attacks. You hope a lot of it stays, but really pretty city. It's like a European city, big European city. Okay, so so in the 19th century, we have this cultural awakening, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So now we're moving on to the 20th century. So in the 20th century, you have World War I starts, of course, in 1914. Big war, it's a world war, right? Russia fights in it. Russia does terribly in the war. The Tsar of Russia is a real loser. Here I'll agree with Trump, loser. Tsar was a real loser. He was weak politically, terribly militarily. He decided to take over the military function, ran the Russian military, and the Russians, as per what they usually do, just lost tens, they lost tens of millions of people, but they lost, millions of soldiers. Just a horrible, horrible war. So by 1917, Germany felt, they could get the Russians to pull out of the war. They had Lenin waiting in Switzerland. Lenin was this communist. Marx had done the theory of communism, and Lenin was a real true Marxist, believed in communism. The Germans stashed him away in Switzerland, and then when they saw that the Russians were losing so badly, and the Russians, even because they were losing, they couldn't feed themselves. Being in Russia during World War I, terrible situation. So the Germans got the idea if they brought Lenin back into Russia, he'd take over the country and pull Russia out of the war, and they wouldn't have to fight the Russians, which is what happened. They sent them by train into Russia. Then he fought, and it wasn't that simple because he fought with the Reds, and then there was the White Russians. So the Russians themselves fought each other. And so, but what they did do was when the Reds came in and take over Russia, they pulled Russia out of the war. So then Germany could send their troops in Russia to the Western Front so they could fight the British and French. But what happened is it was chaotic in Russia. And when it was chaotic, so what Ukraine did is they said, oh, okay, we'll just declare ourselves independent. And so they did. Between 1918 and 1921, Ukraine had about 5 separate governments. You have a government come in, and then a bunch of Ukrainians would say, we don't like this government. They'd throw the old government out, and a new government would come in. So you had 5 separate governments till finally Stalin comes in. And boy, Stalin's a piece of work. Actually, if it wasn't, I'm Jewish, if it wasn't for the Holocaust, I think Stalin's the worst guy for the 20th century. But, I'll go with Hitler. But in any event, Stalin comes in 1921, they have the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. So it becomes part of this Soviet Union, and Ukraine is a separate place. It's a republic, like Latvia, Estonia, to other places, but it's separate. And so they're being run by Russia, even though it's a Soviet republic. Russia's the first among equals. You probably heard that phrase before. Okay, so then we're getting to 1932 in terms of Ukrainian history. That's a terrible time in Ukrainian history. It's called a Holodomor. And Ukraine, it was considered the breadbasket of Europe. Why is that? Very fertile land. You know, they produce tons of food that they don't have to eat themselves. There's so much food they could ship it out. Even now, you know, they're talking about ships taking the grain out. Got all this food. So what happens basically is Stalin, he's a communist who wants to collectivize. That's what communists do. They, you know, capitalism's no good. You can't make money on your own. So he collectivizes the farms, makes them state-run farms, combines all these, you know, little farms into big farms. They're very inefficient, and even what they produce, he decides to ship it out. So what happens is a couple of million Ukrainians die from starvation in the breadbasket of Europe. I mean, is communism great or what? So anyway, that's not good. So Ukraine, by the way, we're going to talk about how they suffered World War II. I mean, Ukrainians are used to suffering, sadly. Anyway, we get to 1939. So now Western Ukraine is now annexed by the Soviets. They simply say, forget Republic, we're taking it. And they make a deal with Germany. They say to Germany, you know, we'll make a deal. Poland can have, you know, part of Ukraine, and we'll take part. So that's what happens there. Then of course, Germany takes Poland, so they get all of Ukraine. So anyway, in 1939 and 1945, you know, World War II, originally when the war started, Ukrainians were happy. They said, oh, we're getting rid of the Russians. Let's hear it for the Germans. It'll be better. And of course, it was worse because the Germans, you know, didn't care about the Ukrainians. They just wanted to take the Ukrainian food and ship it back to Germany. And if you were Jewish in Ukraine, you were dead. I mean, you go into concentration camps, 1.5 million Jews in Ukraine wiped out. I mean, and actually it's interesting because a number of the Ukrainians were complicit in that. So the fact that Ukraine has a Jewish president today is just, you know, it's bizarre and ironic. But history changes. Look, you know, we fought the Germans and Japanese. They were our big enemies in World War II. Now they're our friends. The Russians were our enemies in, you know, World War II. Now you could argue they're our enemy. That's what the Republicans get in, and who knows what it'll be. But anyway, we'll see what happens. Anyway, so 5 million Ukrainians die fighting the Nazis. It's just a horrible situation. But let's go to the video. That's not the videotape. Warner Wolf would say that, but let's go to the illustrations. So there's the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. You see, it was just, you know, during the Cold War, you know, it was like us, the West, against the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And Putin remembers the good old days. That's what he remembers. He'd love to go back to that, but hopefully not. But we'll see what happens. Anyway, there's a Holodomor. There's a food shortage. You know, it's ridiculous. All right, so let's get advancing the history a little bit. So now we're in 1954. If you're, I was young, but I was there. But anyway, so Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev now is Stalin's gone. Fortunately, he's dead. Sadly, didn't come sooner, but you know, he lived. But anyway, in 1954, Nikita Khrushchev became, he's a character, by the way. I remember Khrushchev, he got up at the UN, gave a speech, he took his shoe off and he banged it on the podium. I mean, be perfect if he ran for office now in the TV age. This guy knew drama, just great. Anyway, in 54, he gives up Crimea. It's part of Russia. And he transfers it over to the Ukrainians. Now, we're really not sure why he did that. People argue. Some say he did it because he really liked Ukraine. He married a Ukrainian woman. When he was younger, he worked in Ukrainian mines. He must have had Ukrainian friends. And anyway, he didn't think it was that big. Some people say also it was a 300th anniversary of a treaty, and so this was his gift to Ukraine. But Ukraine really wasn't a separate country. So it was like part of the Soviet Union. So he wasn't sort of giving it up to a different nation. He was giving it up to a state. It would like the, you know, Washington, D.C. maybe becomes part of Delaware, but the point is it's still part of the United States. So, you know, it's not a separate thing. But anyway, Putin really constantly talks about that Khrushchev shouldn't have done that. Crimea was always part of Russia. There's mostly Russians living there. which is all true. He's right about that. The problem is when you sign a treaty, that's the deal. If I buy a car and the dealer says, well, it was, but I've got the legal papers. So if you go by rule of law, which I hope still continues after the election, it's what's on paper. Anyway, so Crimea goes. So in 1986, you all remember, or unless you're very young, weren't born then, Chernobyl. That's the nuclear reactor in Ukraine. That blew. That was bad. Radiation, people dying. Land is polluted. And Gorbachev even said, when Chernobyl happened, he said to himself, and he said this publicly, said he really felt the Soviet Union, they can't even run a reactor, and this happens. It's not going to last. So everyone gives Reagan, not everyone. People give Reagan the credit for ending the Soviet Union. Not really. I mean, I don't, but you can if you want. I think really it was just that the thing was going to collapse. And Gorbachev, I mean, I talk about this in another lecture. And of course, Putin hates Gorbachev for giving away the store, which he did. I mean, Gorbachev was sort of this liberal intellectual who didn't run the place like Stalin. Had he did, the Soviet Union wouldn't collapse. I mean, if you run the place like a dictator, like the others did, you keep the peasants in line. But no, he was a smart guy, intellectual. So was his wife. It was like a Clinton-Hillary thing, 2 for the price of 1. And basically, by 1990, they couldn't keep it together. And you can see there in 1990. Well, let's get to 1990. So the Soviet Union, collapses in '89. The Berlin Wall falls. Everyone feels great. In this country, wow, no more. I mean, if you lived through the 50s like I did, you thought the Russians were going to send nuclear weapons, bomb New York, take cover drills under your desk in school because you were going to get killed. But now all of a sudden, the big evil Soviet Union is gone. And Bush, not the son, but George Bush, the father. I mean, you would think he'd do a lot of victory laps. He was very subdued. He was really a gentleman. He didn't really stick it to the Russians. He just was, okay, this happened, and we'll see what happens. But in any event, Ukraine now figured, things falling apart, we'll declare independence. And they declared their independence. They had a Congress, they said, we're out of here, we're an independent country. And Russia declared its independence from the Soviet Union. Russia had never been an independent country. We talk about Russia. No, it was the Soviet Union, it was the Soviets, and it was the Soviet Empire, the Russian Empire. Never the Russian as a country. Russia's only been a country since 1991. So Yeltsin, who then becomes head of Russia, he secedes from the Soviet Union. He says, okay, Russia's a country now. So Russia's a country, Ukraine's a country, and all the other places are countries. And so Ukraine now becomes an independent country. And all the history I've told you, which is interesting, I enjoyed it, hope you did, and I'll recommend the book if you really want to get into it. But basically, Ukraine's a country because they had a Congress, and like Russia, they became a country in '91. So case closed. I don't care what Putin says. That's what happened. Can't go back. The South would like to go back before the Civil War, but I'm not saying all the South, just lots of the South. But anyway, you can't go back. All right. So in 1994, there's this Budapest Memorandum. So of course, what happened when Ukraine was around before they were independent, Russia had lots of nuclear weapons, thousands of them, and many of them were in Ukraine. And so we didn't want them there. The Russians didn't want them there. The Ukrainians had the weapons, they just didn't have the software. So they didn't have the computers to send the weapons anywhere. So they figured, we'll make a deal. We'll get rid of the weapons, but Russia and the United States, you pledge that you'll give us security. And so Russia said, sure, you'll be secure. We said, no problem. So they gave up their nuclear weapons. Obviously, if they had their nuclear weapons and the software, Putin would not have invaded, but that ship has sailed. All right, so now it's 2004. We have the Orange Revolution. That's what they wore. Going to a party, you got to pick a color. They wore orange. So you have the Orange Revolution, and well, let me get to the specifics of the Orange Revolution, because Ukraine's actually, it wasn't like, George Washington comes in and everything's hunky-dory. No, they had the first president, Leonard Kuchma, and was a corrupt guy, but okay, he didn't plan this. He just came in there, wasn't stealing everything, just a few things, which wasn't terrible. But he's there for a number of years, and of course the Russians during the 1990s, it's chaos in Russia. I mean, really utter chaos. It's like these people have been used to a certain system. They've been used to a Soviet system. Now we said, oh, the Soviet system, the communists was so terrible. Well, you get used to things. So they got used to working with a guaranteed health care. Not really jobs. You had a job, whatever the job was, it was kind of guaranteed. The company didn't have to make a profit because the state, was subsidizing everything. So they got pensions. I mean, it wasn't a terribly bad system to live in. You just didn't have fancy cars. You didn't have the latest, appliance. But you had, a little car, an old appliance. But, you can live without a lot of consumer goods. Happiness isn't the latest thing, although in capitalism we sell that you got to have the latest thing, otherwise you should be miserable. But psychological studies show that's not the case. So many of them were okay with it. But then when it collapsed, you had this basic nothing, cool, what would happen? So Yeltsin said, okay, and he started selling off Russian industries to these oligarchs. That's how they became oligarchs. So they were buying these guys with money were buying these industries for pennies on the dollar. So it was just like a you go to an auction. I'm selling the oil industry here. What do you got? Yeah, okay, sold to this guy. So all these oligarchs came in, and Yeltsin was a weak ruler. He was also an alcoholic, like Bush. Oh no, Bush was a former alcoholic, dangerous. But it was also let's not get into Bush. I do a separate lecture on Bush. Anyway, so we have Yeltsin. So Putin comes in the 1990s. Yeltsin brings him in. Putin was a nothing. He was a functionary, a little bit better than that for the KGB in East Germany. But then he's smart enough to come into politics. He rises in the bureaucracy there. Yeltsin likes him, brings him in, likes him so much that eventually when Yeltsin leaves, Putin takes over the place, and Putin establishes some real order. That's why the Russians, even today, many of them like Putin. They remember the 90s when the place was the Wild West. And Putin really, was the law and order guy. He was the sheriff who came to town, who made a cohesive society. So I get it. So Putin comes in, and of course Putin is just livid. He thought Yeltsin was a clown, and most people thought Yeltsin was a clown. So that wasn't a big deal. But he was really furious at Gorbachev. My God, and Khrushchev. Khrushchev gives up Crimea, Gorbachev gives up the Soviet Union. What were these guys thinking? And, Putin's a power-mad dictator. Well, that's okay. So that's his MO. And so now all of a sudden, instead of being the head of the Soviet Union, he's the head of Russia, which is still, not a bad gig. It's 150 million people. You can steal all kinds of money. How much money do you need? You've got billions stashed away probably all over the world. Be okay with me, but okay, he wants more. He's got, a legacy thing going. So, but he's furious at what happens. And also what's happened is these countries that left the Soviet Union, Estonia, Latvia, they're starting to apply for NATO members. Poland is now, they're not starting. Hungary, Czechoslovakia, they're now applying for NATO membership after it breaks up. And NATO's allowing them in. Now that's a big deal for Russia. Now, Russia's been invaded twice by Germany. And to get to Russia, they had to trample through, Eastern Europe. So now the argument goes, I'll make the argument for Putin's side. Well, I got, I had this buffer with all these countries in between me and Germany. Now all these countries, Germany's part of this group, and all of a sudden I'm getting an alliance with Europe, and you're coming closer and closer to my border. You're putting troops and weapons there, NATO membership, and that's not a bad argument, I think. Although you could say, well, we don't really want to attack Russia. We're not really against Russia, but Russians are paranoid, and paranoids could be right. After World War One, they invaded against World War II. You don't know what's going to happen in history. So, they're really upset about this. And in 2008, well, let me not get to 2008. There's so much history in so little time. Anyway, let me get to 1994 to 2004. We had this president, Leonard Kuchma. So he's got this scandal, of course, 10 years, he got that scandal. Anyway, in 2004, the presidential election, Kuchma has this incumbent party, and Kuchma had to step down. So he picks this guy, Viktor Yanukovych, who was supported by Russian President Vladimir Putin. And he's running against a popular pro-democracy opposition leader by the name of Viktor Yushchenko. So it's Yanukovych versus Yushchenko. And in the final months of the campaign, Yushchenko falls mysteriously ill and his face is disfigured. And the doctors, examine the guy, and who'd have thunk he was poisoned? Putin likes to poison people. He poisons a lot of folks, others people. But anyway, he didn't poison him well enough, so the guy lives, although his face is disfigured, but what the heck? He's not auditioning for a Hollywood movie. Anyway, Yanukovych wins the election amid accusations of rigging. So the bad guy, assuming you think Putin's friend's the bad guy, wins the election. And that's when you get this orange revolution. They say, no, the election was rigged. Well, we heard that before. But this one was really probably rigged. Anyway, the massive protests follow, and there's public outcry, and it's known as the Orange Revolution because they're wearing orange. That's the color du jour. So then there's the third vote, and Yushchenko prevails. Okay, finally, in quotes, you could say the good guy prevailed. But then in 2010, Yushchenko's not doing so well. They bring back Yanukovych. So, and people just are funny. Okay, so there's the Crimean transfer. There's Khrushchev. It's a good picture of Khrushchev. He looks younger. The Time cover did a good job with him. Anyway, there's Chernobyl. It was sad. There's the Orange Revolution, orange balloons. Everyone's having a good time. And it's it's fairly bloodless. I mean, great revolution. You get a revolution, you win. No one gets killed. It's a triple winner. There's Yanukovych with his buddy Putin. They're probably thinking, what do you get? Where are you stashing your money? Oh, it's so much money. My God, how much money do you need? Okay, anyway, so then we're going to go, let me just go to 2008. So in 2008, Ukraine formally requests membership into NATO. Now that hadn't happened before. You had all these other countries, but now Ukraine. Now don't forget, Ukraine's border is right on Russia. These other countries are bordering other countries, but Ukraine is bordering Russia. And so when Ukraine is asking into NATO, of course, he's asking the West. And George W. Bush, the guy that that brought us the Iraq War and trillions in debt and thousands killed, and a genius in foreign policy, clearly. He says, oh yeah, let him join NATO, good idea. But the Europeans say, hey, George, calm down, maybe not, because, if they go into NATO, Russia really may, not just talk about stuff, they may invade Ukraine because they may see this as a bridge too far. Don't forget what JFK did when the Russians, provided missiles to Cuba. JFK said, you're 90 miles off the coast of Cuba. Can't do that. Well, we would be 90. You'd be next door to, Russia. You can't have that happen. Anyway, the Ukrainians convinced George Bush that was a bad idea. So they said, okay, no NATO for you, Ukraine. But clearly, Putin was upset. And that wasn't so great. Okay. So so let's get to, let me see if I can, anything else. 2009, we have a Russian gas company that cut off gas to Ukraine. The problem with cutting gas off to Ukraine is the gas flows from Ukraine to Europe, which are also customers. So you couldn't do that for so long, which is why they were building now the second pipeline, which was going to bypass Ukraine. But with this war, that's not happening either. So, Anyway, 2010, we have Yanukovych was elected president. That's Putin's buddy. So now we get this sort of guy who likes Russia. But the people in Ukraine really want to go more towards Europe. because they feel that, you know, it's a better deal. You know, Europe, it's not a total capitalist system, but they see the Europeans are living a lot better than the Russians. So they figured, no, we'll throw our light in with that group. And so most of the Ukrainians now really want to ally more with Europe. And Yanukovych, he's the president, who's Putin's friend, sort of goes along with it, but then he backs out. Says, no, really, I'm going to do a deal. And then Russia gives this guy $15 billion and says, here's, you can pay the debts of Ukraine, don't worry. But the people want to go with Europe. So now we have another revolution called the Maidan Revolution. Well, this one isn't bloodless. This one, you get about 100 people killed, police, other people. But Yanukovych realizes the handwriting on the wall. He's got to go. He runs over to Russia, takes whatever money he has, you know, takes the money. And so that's what happens there. And then, you know, Putin's furious. Not only is he he keeps losing, but now, you know, he's even going to lose his friend running Ukraine. So he decides to, you know what, Crimea has always been Russian. And the people in Crimea, basically, 75% are Russian or who come from Russia. And they kind of like Russia. And many people in Russia actually almost view Crimea as Russia because, you know, it's like Miami, you know, when the nice seaside, that's where the Russians go, just there to Miami. So they said, you know, we'll just take it. So they work a deal with Crimea secedes. Not really, they shouldn't do that. The government, public, they just secede. And of course, at that point, Putin doesn't send in troops, he sends in these guys disguised as soldiers, like Halloween. And so they take over Crimea. And it's you know, at that point, Europe and America put sanctions on Russia. You can't just take over a country, you know. It's rule of law. You ceded it. And Putin said, you know, possession is 9/10 of the law. I got it. Too bad. So anyway, so that's bad. And then Putin has this violence in Donbass, which is the eastern part of Ukraine. Also, these guys in costumes come in there and they take that over. And so Ukraine now is fighting in the eastern part of Ukraine, because in Donbass and Luhansk, which is eastern Ukraine, they're fighting with this Russian invasion. Then you have this Minsk agreement where they're trying to have peace there. That doesn't work. In 2019, you finally have Zelensky elected president. Zelensky's a former actor who acted in a show called Servant of the People, where he plays a part of a social studies teacher who thinks the country's corrupt, decides to run for office and becomes head of Ukraine. I mean, how bizarre is that? So here's an actor in the movie, in his series. It's a good series. You get it on Netflix, Servant of the People. So he becomes, the actor becomes head of Ukraine. So the real actor here becomes head of Ukraine. Anyway, so that's what happened there. Just, you know, Trump tried to get Zelensky to, when Trump was in office, he tried to get Zelensky to give up information that he could use against Biden, Hunter Biden. That didn't work out. So Trump withheld military supplies for a while. Zelensky had to play it cool, which he did. Anyway, in April 2021, you see what happened there. Russian troops at the border, which is a problem. In November 2021, they come back, have lots of troops at the border. There's the Maidan Revolution. That was the bloody revolution. There's the Minsk Agreement. Zelensky's, you can see him there. Well, what are these three people going to do? Throw me under the bus? But who knows? There's Zelensky, stepped up to the plate. I mean, you know, didn't have much of a background. A comedian. Maybe that's what we need in politics, more comedians. So that's what happened there. And of course, Russians, we will remember that. Troops at the border, and Biden's telling Zelensky, they're going to invade, they're going to invade. And Zelensky's saying, I don't think so. Why would they invade? Well, maybe he was just saying that, hoping they wouldn't invade. He was buying himself time, but who knows? But of course, they did invade, and that's certainly a big problem. Anyway, in December 21, Biden tells Putin, "Don't invade. Not a good idea." And you know, Putin's playing it cool, and Putin's realizing, I think, at this point, he's going to invade. He figures, what the heck, and he figures it'll be easy. He probably had, you know, the CIA is really I mean, if you learn about the history, I told you a talk on the CIA. My God, they've done 5% good and 95% terrible. I mean, they didn't even predict the fall of the Soviet Union. I mean, and so I'm guessing the Russians have an equivalent bad organization like the CIA that gave them just bad intelligence. And so basically, they must have said, to Putin, you send troops in, they'll go right to Kyiv, you'll set up a puppet government. You want to have a problem with the Ukrainians, don't worry about it. And Putin probably listened to them, just like Kennedy listened to the CIA when he did the Bay of Pigs. That didn't work out so well. Anyway, Putin invades, and of course, January 2022, the US and Russia are negotiating, don't invade. Anyway, in February 2022, in eastern Ukraine, they're starting to, Putin's saying to people living in eastern Ukraine, you got to get out because Ukraine's going to invade you. It's fake news. Okay, in February 21st, Putin formally recognizes the Donetsk and Luhansk Republic. Okay, so that's like, we could formally recognize Canada as part of the US. That's basically what he did. And in February 24th, of course, Russia attacks. They sent, this long 40-mile column towards Kyiv. I mean, I get it if he thought that it was going to be a cakewalk and it wasn't going to be a problem. But the Ukrainians actually were pretty good at fighting because they'd spent so much time fighting in eastern Ukraine. They were used to, fighting that, fairly good equipment, Russian equipment, but it worked. And they were driving over in Ukraine. They didn't, with that place, it wasn't like in eastern Ukraine, there were places that you could hide behind, like trees and, hills and things like that, where Ukrainian soldiers could hide behind and shoot at these Russians coming down a road. And then we gave them lots of equipment, these anti-tank stuff that they could shoot an anti-tank missile at a tank and blow it up and then run away. And some of these anti-tank things were so good, they would go up in the air and come down on the turret of the tank because that's the least armored part of the tank. So, Russia was totally defeated, really huge, super humiliation, which, obviously Putin couldn't let that stand. And so what happened is, of course, then they pulled out there and then they invaded from the east. It's an easier thing to do. And so we're finally where today we have a situation where, you read in the paper every day, Ukraine's in the news constantly. Right now, hopefully they're going to take over Kherson. The winter's coming. It's bad because the Russians now have bombed a lot of the power plants over there, so they're going to freeze. Although, the weather's been warm. So we're like, on the islands, we're going to maybe set a record today. Even in Europe, the weather's been warm. So they've been able to conserve gas. So who knows, if they get a really warm winter, which would be great, that'd be good. Anyway, I'm going to recommend one book and then throw this open to questions and comments. If you really want to read a book on the history of Ukraine, a really in-depth history, you want to spend time on this, it's The Gates of Europe. The author's name is impossible to pronounce and crazily, by English, a crazy spelling, but it's Serhii Plohi. So it's Serhii, which is a name like John in Ukrainian, and Plohi, Plokhy. But if you Google Gates of Europe, or go to a library, you can get the book. Okay, I've done my duty. That's it. So I'll take questions and answers if you have any.
Okay, we have Richard made a comment and a question. Richard Bronstein, do you want to ask your question or is he in?
Yeah. Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes.
Yeah. You briefly went over the attempt by Trump to extort Zelensky. Did that withholding of military aid, was that a major problem? And the second question along with that, a major problem for Ukraine. And the second question along with that was, do you think that emboldened Putin to do his invasion?
Those are good questions. So my first thing is, it stopped the military supplies from going in for a while. But, Trump doesn't have a long attention span. So he ignored it for a while, and then the military kept sending it in. So they were getting equipment. So I don't think that was the super big problem. The bigger problem was when Russia invaded, we didn't give them equipment fast enough. And I understand that too, because when they invaded, I think Europe and the United States felt Russia was going to win because the CIA didn't give us good intelligence, really. So we didn't know that the Ukrainians were really going to fight. So when they did fight and they were able to turn back the invasion, at that point, we started throwing weapons at them because we said, wow, this is, this is a good team here. It's not just not to wait till next year. So we can do it this year. And so we gave them lots of weapons. So that was certainly the case. And the second part of your question was,
The second part was, did you think Putin felt emboldened by Trump's withholding of aid?
I do. I think he felt emboldened. I think also we felt emboldened just by Trump. First of all, Trump liked him. And you could argue why. But anyway, he felt that. And also he felt just the idea of Trump, that our country was now so divisive. It wasn't like, we was kind of united. Back in the 50s, who was against? We were so united as a country. The communism was bad. Very few people were talking for communism. And so, but even right before Trump, we were divisive, but on foreign policy, we weren't that divided. The Republicans, were always against the Russians up until Trump. But once Trump came in, it looked like to Putin, I guess, well, I'll invade and the US won't give it too much because the Republicans seem to like me. And, the US doesn't seem to care that much about foreign policy. They got enough about their own domestic issues. So I think on that level, yeah, I think that might have, you don't know how dictators, you don't know how anybody thinks truly. But I think that's a reasonable supposition.
I think that's all the questions in the chat, but if anybody else has questions, please raise their hand or raise your virtual hand or speak up.
Yeah, this is your opportunity to weigh in on, you're all reading about it, I'm sure. What is it?
Sandy's iPad. Unmute and you can ask your question. Sandy? There you go.
Yes, okay. I happened to see today that our dear idiot friend Marjorie Taylor Greene said that once the Republicans are in power, the Ukraine won't get any more US aid under the GOP. What are your thoughts?
Well, sad, to use a Trump expression, and maybe even the intonation, sad. But anyway, they're terrible. Green, of course, is, Trump is extreme. Green is extreme. I don't know that obviously, if she was president, who knows what would happen. But assuming the Republicans take over the Congress, which is a possibility, certainly the House is a distinct possibility. Biden will continue to want to do it. We've got so much in place now that I think any major turnaround would be unlikely. But it could be cut back. It could be more pressure for Ukraine to make a deal. You constantly hear people saying, not a lot of people, but certainly when they were losing, it's a loser of a war. Just solve it somehow. And the deal would probably look like something where Ukraine would give up the eastern provinces, because Putin can't come out of this going back to the status quo ante, going back to where he doesn't have Crimea. He doesn't have the eastern provinces. He just was the head of a losing war. If he doesn't shoot himself, someone else will do it. Come on, it's terrible. It's got to come out with something. And of course, Zelensky's arguing he's going to come out with nothing. So obviously there can't be negotiations. But chances are there might be a little bit of a step down, but I don't think it'll be a major step down unless Ukraine really has tremendous reverses on the battlefield. We're so geared up at this point towards helping them. We're even going to be training them and training soldiers in Europe. We're sending our soldiers there. Our military, I think, likes this Ukrainian situation because, and the defense industry loves it here. I mean, my God, if you have defense stocks, I mean, you can't make bullets and missiles and all this other stuff fast enough. You make any aircraft or aircraft, whatever it is, systems, you should ship them over. Whatever you make, you can sell. I mean, it's a fantastic business. So therefore the war, clearly. I think that our military likes the war because you got all these officers trained to do war. And here you can do war on the cheap. You don't have to lose any of your own troops. I'm sure the Ukrainians are consulting with our generals and European generals on strategy. I mean, we don't say that the Ukrainians can take the credit, but I'm sure we're really helping with intelligence stuff like that. So, the military's for it because you can sort of game out, you do with toy soldiers. We're not toy soldiers, but these are human beings, but you're not using your own men and losing your own men. So it's a huge deal for the military. So I think they're for the war. I'm probably they're wanting to stay in it. It's a reasonable, if you have any kind of moral thing that free people ought to be free, and some Republicans who still believe that. I think even some of the Mitch McConnell, I think, believes that. I think he's really for the war. I mean, a lot of the people in Congress, the older ones who really were against the Russians for so long, they got to placate the base in some way, but they still hate the Russians, and it's in their, their DNA, whatever that is. But so, but yeah, if Marjorie Taylor Greene was president, I'm leaving the country. My wife keeps saying leaving the country. I keep saying, nah, don't worry. But yeah, I'll leave. But anyway, but I don't think she'll be president, but who knows? But anyway, that's my best answer to your question.
Anyone else? Any other questions?
Yeah, there's a hand. Is it Connie or?
Yes, hi. The New York Times Magazine section on Sunday had a long article about Ukraine, and the reporter spoke about Paul Manafort and all of his work for years before the 2016 election on behalf of Putin. And he was basically operating as a foreign agent for the United States undercover, making deals. And one of the exchanges was, that Putin helped out to get Trump elected. And, again, all secret. And he helped them get his guy, Yanukovych,
Yanukovych
elected. And
right.
And actually was responsible for the a shift when Trump did become president in policy towards Ukraine. The language was softened, and so all of that was kind of a lead up to the war itself. So I think Trump bears responsibility for the all of that, to allow that to happen and to see it as, okay, you can do this, we won't react, and so forth.
Yeah, 100% right. I saw the article, but I knew that even before the article. Manafort just, wow, if this was the 1950s, he'd be at the House Un-American Activities Committee, McCarthy would get him. But anyway, yeah, total, do anything for money,
Yes, he made a fortune.
Total. And that's really why he did it. I mean, if you look for ideology from a guy like Manafort, the ideology is green money. I mean, clearly it was a great way to make money. You support these people and you make money, and then he gets into politics. And Trump, what's Trump's ideology? Pretty much the same. I suspect. I mean, if there's any Trump people here, you can argue differently, but I mean, I don't think he has a major foreign policy ideology other than, help me build a hotel somewhere in your country. But other than that, I mean, it's basically a money thing. And the base, I mean, everything, they don't care. It's a matter of foreign policy is just not that interesting to basically pretty much a lot of people in this country. we have so many domestic problems that it's tough to really get the people to rally around something that's happening overseas. And certainly to his base, which feels aggrieved in all sorts of ways, angry, about how they've been treated. They're losing their status as, preeminent ethnic group, and certain people feel that way. And so for them, whatever, it's a meaningless issue. But yeah, Manafort was just, wow, if there's a heaven, but who knows? But anyway, the Times did a great job with that, spelling it out. But it's not like they discovered anything new.
Okay.
This was known, when Manafort came in, he was working for these people. It was known then. But but what's great about Trump is things happen so fast, the concentration goes off. The next day it's to something else.
Right.
Yeah, but thank you.
Yeah.
Good point.
Arthur, you have a question?
Yeah, back to Paul Manafort, which isn't the main topic of today's session. But anyway, one of the things I recall was that he was accused in the run-up of Trump's election of giving polling data, Republican polling data, to the Russians. And I think that is a big deal, because I think that was a means of how the Russians could assess how their propaganda was working by getting that as a result of the false information they had planted.
Yeah, I'm guessing that might be true, for sure. And then the Russians did it by sending these bots in. But let's face it, we don't have the greatest educated population. So, the fact that they could be influenced by this, and also, honestly, we've done the same thing in elections in other places. I'm not excusing the Russians. This is a terrible thing. But if you look at American history, we've influenced elections in other places. We've overthrown governments. You look at Iran, we overthrew a democratically elected government in Iran in 1952 and in Guatemala in 54. So, we don't have clean hands on this. I'm not saying that the Russians shouldn't do it and we should hold them accountable. We should. They shouldn't be influencing elections. But countries influence elections. And what would be better, of course, is if we had a more educated country, but that's a long-term project. But you're right. I think probably that did help getting the polling data, and then the guys in a building in St. Petersburg, or wherever they were doing it, could then, influence the election through these bots, which go to people and influence how they think. But yeah, sure, we can definitely hold that against him too. Not that it matters, because Manafort's got a pardon, so he skates.
Any other questions, comments? No? Yes, that's it. Well,
Yep.
Marty, thank you very much for doing this. We
Thank you.
appreciate it.